Hey, I'm Daniel. I spent 20 years as a professor of religious history. Then I discovered something that cost me my career, but I couldn't keep it to myself. What Spinoza found, it changes everything you think you know.
The more you try to reconcile what Matthew and Luke wrote about the birth of Jesus, the more impossible it becomes. I have been sitting with that sentence for longer than I expected to, because it sounds like the kind of thing someone says to provoke, a blunt instrument designed for effect, and I want to be clear that it is not. It is a precise description of what happens when you actually read the two texts side by side, carefully, without the protective layer of assumption that most of us bring to them from decades of Christmas services and nativity plays and homilies that have always treated the two accounts as a single coherent story. They are not a single coherent story. They are two distinct narratives, written by two different authors, serving two different theological purposes, deploying two entirely different sets of events. Events that, when placed alongside each other, cannot both have happened. Not cannot easily be harmonized, cannot both have happened. The mutual exclusivity is structural, not incidental, and Spinoza arrived at a conclusion from this that every major church has hidden from its congregation for 2,000 years. That is not rhetorical excess. That is what the documents show. I'm going to take you through them this morning, and I want to take you through them the way I came to understand what they contained, which was not through a dramatic single revelation, but through a series of moments, one leading to the next, each one slightly colder than the one before it, each one making the next step in the argument feel not like a discovery, but like an inevitability. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you something that I have never seen addressed in any Sunday sermon, any confirmation class, any pastoral letter, any Christmas broadcast. I'm going to show you the exact mechanism by which both Matthew and Luke reached Bethlehem. And when you understand that mechanism, Bethlehem ceases to be a place of birth. It becomes a conclusion, a theological destination that both authors needed to arrive at, for reasons that had nothing to do with where a particular child was actually born. But I want to begin where the argument begins. Most people who are raised in a Christian tradition know in some general way that the birth of Jesus is described in the New Testament. They know the stable, the manger, the star, the wise men, the shepherds. They know Bethlehem. They know the flight into Egypt. They know that Herod ordered a massacre. What most people have never been told is that only two of the four Gospels describe the birth at all. Mark, widely considered by scholars to be the earliest of the four canonical Gospels, does not begin with a birth narrative. It begins with the baptism of a grown man. Mark's Jesus arrives in the first chapter fully formed, a man around 30 years old coming down to the Jordan to be baptized by John. There is no manger, no star, no shepherds, no wise men, no flight into Egypt. Mark has no interest or no knowledge of anything that occurred before the moment John the Baptist puts water on Jesus of Nazareth's head. John, the latest of the four Gospels, written toward the end of the first century, also has no birth narrative in the conventional sense. John opens with theology. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The cosmic pre-existence of Christ, not a birth in Bethlehem. John's Jesus enters the narrative as an adult, in Galilee at a wedding in Cana. Two of the four Gospels say nothing at all about the circumstances of Jesus' birth. And that by itself should tell us something. If the birth in Bethlehem, the star, the massacre, the flight into Egypt, were events of the order of significance that later tradition assigned to them, events that defined the theological identity of the figure at the center of these narratives, it is, at minimum, remarkable that two of the four evangelists had no awareness of or interest in any of it. Now listen carefully, because this is the part that Spinoza identified that no Christmas sermon will ever cover. The two Gospels that do describe the birth describe two completely different events, different locations, different characters, different sequences, different theological emphases, and, crucially, different geographical starting points that contradict each other at the most fundamental level of the story. They do not merely differ in detail, they are mutually exclusive. Matthew comes first, and Matthew's account presupposes something that most readers have absorbed so gradually they have never noticed it as a presupposition. In Matthew's Gospel, Joseph and Mary are already in Bethlehem. There is no journey to Bethlehem. There is no arrival in Bethlehem. They are simply there. Chapter 1 closes with the birth. Chapter 2 opens with wise men arriving from the east, asking where the newborn king of the Jews is to be found. Herod summons his chief priests and scribes who identify Bethlehem as the prophesied location. The star guides the Magi to a house, not a stable, not a manger. A house. They find Mary and the child inside, present gifts, and depart by another route. Then Joseph receives a warning in a dream. Take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Herod is about to search for the child and destroy him, so the family flees to Egypt, where they remain until Herod dies. Then they are instructed to return. But upon learning that Herod's son Archelaus is ruling in Judea, Joseph is afraid to return there. And so, for the first time in Matthew's narrative, the family settles in Galilee in a town called Nazareth. This is Matthew's account. In Matthew, Nazareth is where the family ends up. They go there at the end, under specific circumstances, having first lived in Bethlehem, having fled to Egypt, having been unable to return to their home in Judea. Now I want to take you to what I was looking at one evening in November, in my own study here in Norwich, with the desk lamp on, and the lamp the only light in the room. The candles of the afternoon gone before 5, which is the English winter being what it is. I had Matthew chapters 1 and 2 open in front of me, and I was doing something I had done before, but not with sufficient attention. I was listing every event in Matthew's infancy narrative and tracking it against the Old Testament text that Matthew explicitly cited as its justification. Event 1. The birth in Bethlehem. Matthew chapter 2 verse 6 cites Micah chapter 5 verse 2. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Event 2. The star. Matthew chapter 2 cites no text explicitly for the star's appearance, but the background reference is Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Event 3. The flight into Egypt. Matthew chapter 2 verse 15 cites Hosea chapter 11 verse 1. Out of Egypt I called my son. Event 4. The massacre of the innocents. Matthew chapter 2 verse 18 cites Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 15. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted, because they are no more. Event 5. The settlement in Nazareth. Matthew chapter 2 verse 23 cites what he describes as the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene, though this verse does not appear in any surviving version of the Old Testament, which is itself a matter that would require a separate investigation. I put the pencil down on the desk. The tea to my left had gone cold at some point, and I had not noticed. What I was looking at was not a series of events that happened to fulfill prophecy. What I was looking at was a series of events constructed to fulfill prophecy. Every scene in Matthew's infancy narrative, every geographical movement, every dramatic crisis, the massacre, the flight, the return, maps precisely and deliberately onto a list of Old Testament citations that Matthew quotes explicitly as justification for each one. Matthew was not recording biography. Matthew was doing exegesis in reverse. He had a list of prophetic texts that the Messiah must fulfill, and he constructed a narrative in which that fulfillment was systematically achieved. This is not my observation. This is what careful readers of Matthew have been noting since the 19th century at least. Raymond Brown, whose Birth of the Messiah remains the most thorough academic comparison of the infancy narratives, is precise about this. Matthew's birth narrative is structured around formula quotations. The events are introduced by the need to demonstrate scriptural fulfillment, not the reverse. The feeling sitting with that list was not anger. It was the quieter feeling of recognizing a methodology I had encountered many times in other contexts, the methodology of retroactive theological construction, which is a perfectly legitimate form of religious writing. It is the form of a man who knows the conclusion and works backward to find the premises. It becomes a problem only when it is presented as documentary history, which is precisely how it has been presented for 2,000 years. Now, Luke's account opens in an entirely different world. Luke chapter 1 verse 26 is explicit, very explicit. The angel Gabriel is sent from God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. Nazareth is not the place they end up in Luke. Nazareth is the place they already are before anything happens. Joseph and Mary are inhabitants of Nazareth. This is their home, their ordinary life. The Annunciation happens in Nazareth. The pregnancy begins in Nazareth. Then Luke introduces the mechanism that moves the family to Bethlehem, a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. The birth happens in Bethlehem. There is no house, there is a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Shepherds are told by an angel. They come to find the child lying in the manger. There are no wise men. There is no star guiding anyone. There is no Herod trying to find the child. There is no massacre. There is no flight into Egypt. And then, Luke chapter 2, verse 39, when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. Luke says this explicitly. When everything was finished, the circumcision, the purification, the presentation at the temple, they returned to Nazareth, their own town, without detour, without Egypt, without any encounter with Herod whatsoever. That verse leaves no space in the chronology for an escape into Egypt, for years of residence there, for a return blocked by the presence of Archelaus in Judea. In Luke's narrative, there is no conceivable moment in which the flight to Egypt could have happened. The family's movements are accounted for, from Nazareth to Bethlehem, from Bethlehem to Jerusalem for the temple presentation, from Jerusalem back to Nazareth. Luke then tells us in the very next verses that the family returned to Nazareth annually for Passover. They are established residents of Nazareth. They have always been residents of Nazareth. The Egyptian sojourn that is the centerpiece of Matthew's account does not exist in Luke's world. These two accounts describe mutually exclusive events. I want to say that with the simplicity it deserves, not as hyperbole, not as provocation, as the straightforward reading of two texts that cannot both be accurate descriptions of the same sequence of events. Either the family started in Bethlehem and fled to Egypt, in which case there is no room for Luke's census journey, and returned to Nazareth as a native town, or the family started in Nazareth and made a temporary census journey to Bethlehem, in which case there is no room for Matthew's Egypt and massacre and decade of residence abroad. You cannot fit both into the same history without introducing harmonizations for which neither text provides any basis. Here is the part that I need to be careful about, because the evidence is very specific, and I want to present it with the precision it deserves. Luke places the birth during a census conducted while Quirinius was governor of Syria. This census is described as the reason for Joseph and Mary's journey to Bethlehem. We know from sources entirely independent of the New Testament when Quirinius became governor of Syria. Publius Sulpicius Quirinius was appointed legate of Syria in 6 AD, not 6 BC, 6 AD, 6 years after the conventional date for the birth of Jesus, and 10 years after the death of Herod the Great. This is not a matter of scholarly dispute. The appointment is documented in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, which describes the census that Quirinius conducted as the event that triggered a Jewish rebellion led by Judas of Galilee, an event that Josephus dates to the annexation of Judea to the province of Syria in 6 AD. Matthew, meanwhile, places the birth explicitly during the reign of Herod the Great. Herod died in 4 BC. Most scholars who take the Matthean chronology seriously place the birth no later than 6 or 7 BC to allow time for the Magi's visit and the period of hiding before Herod's death. The gap between Herod's death in 4 BC and the census of Quirinius in 6 AD is 10 years. Matthew and Luke cannot both be right about when the birth occurred. One of them has the chronology wrong, and the question is not which. Both have introduced elements whose historical basis does not survive scrutiny. I spent part of an early morning in a university library I had used for other research. working through secondary accounts of Roman census practice. The room had the cold of a room that has not yet decided whether the heating has come on. I had brought a thermos of tea that was poorly made and remained mostly undrunk. I had my notebook open on the table in front of me, and I was writing down every question that presented itself. The census in Luke introduces a requirement that Joseph travel to Bethlehem because he was of the house and lineage of David. This is the mechanism. Ancestral city of origin determines where you register. No Roman census in the ancient world required this. No census anywhere in the Roman Empire, at any period for which we have documentation, required inhabitants to travel to the ancestral city of their lineage. Roman censuses registered people where they lived and where they owned property. The entire administrative purpose of a census was to assess taxable assets in place. Requiring everyone to travel to an ancestor's city of origin would have made the exercise administratively nonsensical. And for a man of the house of David, the ancestor in question had been dead for approximately 1,000 years. The question I wrote in my notebook that morning: if Joseph was of the house and lineage of David, how many generations back does that lineage run, and how many other people from the same tribe were presumably also making this journey? Does not have an answer in Luke's text, because Luke's text is not interested in the administrative logistics. The census exists to explain the geography. It is a narrative device to get Joseph and Mary from Nazareth, where Luke knows they live, to Bethlehem, where Luke knows the Messiah must be born. This is where Spinoza's method produces results that the historical record alone cannot reach. Spinoza approached the biblical texts with a single persistent question. Not what does this text claim, but what were the conditions of the people who produced it? What purposes, theological, political, pastoral, shaped the specific form this text took? He refused to treat any part of the biblical narrative as if it had arrived from outside the processes that shape every other human cultural production. Applied to the infancy narratives, his method begins not with events but with genealogies. Because the genealogies of Jesus are where the two accounts reveal their contradictory theological projects most nakedly. Matthew chapter 1 verses 1 to 17 opens the gospel with a genealogy that traces Joseph's lineage from Abraham, through David, through Solomon, the royal line, the line of the kings of Judah, down through 42 generations to Joseph, husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. Luke chapter 3 verses 23 to 38 contains a genealogy that traces Joseph's lineage from Jesus backward through David, but not through Solomon, through Nathan, a different son of David, and from Nathan through an entirely different set of ancestors, all the way back not merely to Abraham but to Adam, son of God. These two genealogies diverge immediately after David. Matthew goes through Solomon, Luke goes through Nathan. They do not converge again. They share no names between David and Joseph. They are two entirely different lineages for the same man, Joseph, the husband of Mary. Read Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 side by side. I'm not making an interpretive claim here. I'm describing what the texts say. The names are different. The ancestors are different. The theological trajectories are different. Matthew wants to connect Jesus to the royal line of Solomon, to demonstrate that he is the legitimate heir to the throne of David in the specifically royal sense. Luke wants to connect Jesus to all of humanity. His genealogy reaches back to Adam, the progenitor of the human race, establishing Jesus as the figure whose significance is universal rather than specifically Israelite. Both genealogies were constructed to serve theological purposes, and the purposes were incompatible enough that the authors produced two genealogies that cannot both be historically accurate. Spinoza's observation is precise. When Scripture contradicts Scripture, at least one author was building theology, not transcribing history. Both genealogies are theological constructions, the question of which, if either reflects historical fact, is secondary to the observation that they were built for purposes that left no space for factual consistency. This is the part that never makes it into Christmas sermons, for obvious reasons. Now I am going to tell you what every serious scholar who has carefully read these texts already knows. I have been moving toward this for some time. I want to be careful about how I say it, because the claim is significant, and I intend to present it as what it is, the conclusion of a methodological argument, not an ideological assertion. The independent attestation of Jesus' place of origin is remarkably consistent. Mark, the earliest gospel, the one with no birth narrative, refers to Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth or the Nazarene multiple times. The designation is fundamental to Mark's presentation. Paul's letters, the earliest text in the New Testament by a considerable margin, written in the 50s of the first century, decades before any of the Gospels, never once refer to Jesus as being from Bethlehem. Paul knows Jesus as Jesus Christ, occasionally as a descendant of David by lineage, but the geographical designation that appears in Paul is not Bethlehem. The Q material, the hypothetical saying source reconstructed by scholars from the common material in Matthew and Luke, not found in Mark, knows nothing of a Bethlehem birth. Its Jesus is the itinerant teacher of Galilee. John's Gospel, despite its theological sophistication and its late date, gives us an interesting scene. In John chapter 7, when the question of Jesus' identity is being debated among the crowd at the temple, some people say, "Can the Christ come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was?" The very people arguing that Jesus cannot be the Messiah because he is not from Bethlehem, their objection to Jesus assumes that Jesus is from Galilee. The crowd in John's Gospel who reject Jesus' messianic claims are rejecting them precisely because he is known to be from Nazareth, not Bethlehem. John does not correct this by saying, "But actually he was born in Bethlehem, haven't you heard?" John's Jesus simply says, "You know me, and you know where I am from." The geographical objection is left standing, unanswered in terms of birthplace. Nazareth appears nowhere in the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible. Nowhere. It was a village of approximately 400 people in first-century Galilee, with no messianic significance, no association with Davidic lineage, no prophetic weight at all. The town was so obscure that scholars have debated whether it existed in the relevant period, though recent archaeology has confirmed its existence, if not its significance. Nothing about Nazareth recommended it as the birthplace of a Messiah. Nothing about Nazareth made it theologically useful. Bethlehem was the birthplace of David, the ancestral city of the great king, the place from which Micah chapter 5 verse 2 had prophesied the coming of a ruler who would be great in Israel. Bethlehem was theologically necessary. Bethlehem was the destination that the messianic expectation had prepared. It was a conference in the north of England. I cannot place the city exactly. Somewhere industrial. Somewhere that gets autumn early and holds on to it. The kind of conference venue that runs its heating at a temperature that is always slightly insufficient for the rooms. The sessions had ended for the afternoon. The corridor was clearing. I was speaking briefly with someone whose work on the Synoptic Gospels I had been reading for some years. A well-published scholar, well-regarded, the kind of name that appears in footnotes in serious academic writing on this material. We had perhaps 4 minutes of conversation. I raised the question of Nazareth as the historically probable birthplace, the absence of independent attestation for Bethlehem in the earliest sources. He listened without hurrying me. And then he said quite quietly, "Nobody who has read this carefully since Strauss thinks it happened in Bethlehem." He paused, and then he added, "But you understand why we don't say that in print." The corridor was emptying toward the evening meal. His tone was calm, almost gentle, the tone of someone describing the weather, not confessing something. Then he moved on. He joined the group heading toward dinner. I remained where I was for a moment, in the emptying corridor, with what he had said settling in the air where it had been spoken. Nobody who has read this carefully thinks it happened in Bethlehem. But you understand why we don't say that in print. Stay with me. Because what I am about to describe is the conclusion that follows from everything you have just heard, the one that institutions have most carefully declined to state in public, even as their own scholars arrived at it independently, decade after decade, in corridors very much like the one I was standing in. Spinoza's method, applied with patience to the two infancy narratives, produces a conclusion that is methodologically precise. Both Matthew and Luke arrived at Bethlehem as a conclusion before they built their narratives. Matthew built a retroactive prophetic fulfillment narrative in which every event exists to satisfy an Old Testament citation. Luke built a census mechanism to transport a family he knew to be from Nazareth to the prophetically necessary destination. Both authors were working backward from a theological requirement. The historical plausibility of the mechanisms they constructed, the retroactive prophetic events, the administratively impossible census, is secondary to their function, which was to place Jesus in Bethlehem. This is not what the Gospels present themselves as doing. They present themselves as historical accounts of actual events, and the Church has presented them as such for 2,000 years, explicitly managing the contradictions between them, harmonizing what cannot be harmonized, and declining to ask the question that the contradictions make unavoidable. The question is not, were Matthew and Luke being dishonest? That is the wrong question, and it leads nowhere useful. The question is, what were they doing? And what they were doing is what religious authors in the ancient world routinely did. They were constructing a narrative that served a theological purpose, using the techniques that their tradition made available to them: retroactive prophecy, genealogical construction, typological parallelism, and they were doing it in service of an argument they believed profoundly. Matthew believed that Jesus was the Messiah in the royal Davidic sense, and he built his infancy narrative to prove it. Luke believed that Jesus was the Savior of all humanity, and he built his infancy narrative to prove that. They were not writing biography, they were writing theology. The mistake, the 2,000-year mistake, was to receive theology as if it were biography. And the specific uncomfortable conclusion that follows from all of this is one that Spinoza arrived at through exactly this kind of textual analysis, and that every careful reader of these documents has arrived at independently since. The historical Jesus was almost certainly born in Nazareth, not Bethlehem, Nazareth, the town that appears in every independent source, in the earliest sources, in the sources that show no knowledge of a birth narrative at all. The town that has no prophetic weight and no theological usefulness, and therefore no reason to have been invented. Bethlehem is where the theological argument required Jesus to be born. Nazareth is where the evidence places him. What does this mean? Spinoza's fundamental argument, the argument at the center of his method, is this: the biblical texts are human documents, written by human beings, at specific historical moments, with specific theological and political purposes. Understanding them honestly requires treating them as exactly what they are. Matthew and Luke are not failures as authors or as theologians, because their infancy narratives contradict each other and strain against the historical record. They were doing what their tradition equipped them to do. The failure is not theirs. The failure belongs to 2,000 years of institutional management that declared the question of contradiction itself out of bounds. The colleague in the corridor knew the answer. He has known it for decades. His published work does not say it. The institution has a gravitational field, and it operates whether or not the individuals within it are conscious of it. The nativity story most people carry, the stable, the star, the shepherds, the wise men, the manger in Bethlehem, is a composite, constructed from two sources that contradict each other, layered together over centuries of liturgical practice until the seams became invisible. The shepherds are from Luke, the wise men are from Matthew. They never appear in the same narrative. They appear together in the tradition because the tradition needed a birth story that felt complete, and built one by combining sources its own authors had already made incompatible. The documents are readable. They have been readable for centuries. The question has been managed rather than asked. Not because the answer is unclear to those who have examined it, but because the asking of it is inconvenient to institutions that derive authority from what they claim the texts contain. That is not conspiracy. It is the structural preference of any institution for the narrative that maintains its authority over the narrative that subjects that authority to honest scrutiny. Spinoza described this mechanism 350 years ago in a book immediately banned by the Catholic Church and condemned by the Amsterdam Rabbinical Council. The institutions recognized what he was doing. You are part of a small group who followed this through to the end. Most people stop before the contradictions become fully visible. You didn't. That says something. If this conversation is worth continuing, let me know by staying subscribed. There is more to examine, there always is. Take care of yourselves.
If you know someone still trapped in religious fear, someone who needs to know the historical truth. Share this with them, anonymously if you have to. Sometimes one video changes everything.